that the Wright brothers developed in terms of changing the lift on one side or the other, just a different mechanization between their wing warping and the ailerons. Okay, so let's come down here. Neither of them went to college. They were high school graduates, but they basically had to teach themselves everything they knew about airplanes. They became interested in aviation from reading about experiments like Otto Lilienthal and other experimenters of the time. So when they became interested in flying machines, they built their first gliders. They developed their ring warping concept. They went to Kitty Hawk in 1900 with their first glider. That glider had that wing warping technology incorporated in it. They first flew it as a kite. So if you see the photo there on the wall, you see that the glider there with just ropes coming down because they were flying it as a kite to see if it would actually work the way they expected. Once they proved that the wing warping operated the way they thought, then they got in it and flew it as a glider. They flew several, did a number of experiments there at Kitty Hawk. They determined that they were not getting as much lift as they expected. They were using Otto Lilienthal's data. They decided that his data was an error, so when they came back to Dayton, they built a wind tunnel like this. This is a reproduction of it, but this is an exact reproduction of the wind tunnel. They used this wind tunnel to test various airfoil shapes and wing shapes to collect their own data to then use to develop, to design the next glider. Next time they went back to Kitty Hawk in 1901, they had an improved glider, and it flew more as they expected, and they were able to really practice flying. So in 1901, 1902, they basically taught themselves how to fly. So they basically concentrated on learning to fly, learning how to control the aircraft, making sure that they fully understood how the aircraft flew and operated. So that was really what they were doing in 1901, 1902. Now the reason they were going to Kitty Hawk was it's on the coast, so it has steady winds coming off the ocean. So steady winds they could launch into. It had sand dunes, so they could launch from the top of the sand dune and glide down. It was nice, soft, sandy soil, so it wasn't hard to hit. And there were very few trees, so it was an ideal location for your gliding experiments. So that's why they chose Kitty Hawk. As I said, 1902 they had finished learning how to fly. So in 1903 they decided it was time to put an engine on it. They had designed their own engine because at that time gasoline engines had only been around for about 20 years. They were new technology, so they couldn't just go out and buy one. They had to design and build their own engine. They had to design and build their own propellers because the only information they could get on propellers was based on ship propellers, driving a ship through the water. So in order to design a propeller for driving a vehicle through the air, they had to come up with their own theories on how best to design that. So they had to develop that, design and build their own propellers. They designed and built all the mechanism, the drive shaft, and et cetera, to work that. They had to basically expand the size of their aircraft to carry the additional weight of the engine and propellers, et cetera. So once they had their new vehicle, their Powerade vehicle, they went back to Kitty Hawk in 1903. So in December of 1903, they had their first successful flight of a manned flight of a powered, controlled, heavier than air aircraft. They took off from level ground, climbed, controlled the airplane, and landed. Now, they only flew 4 times on December 17th. That was the day of their flight. They only flew 4 times. The last flight was the longest and only lasted 59 seconds, and they only went 800 feet. But they proved that they could take off, control the airplane, and land. So they proved that they could now fly independently of the hills. They no longer needed to go to Kitty Hawk for the hills. They could now take off from level ground. So from that point on, they continued their experiments here in the Dayton area. They rented a cow pasture. It's called the Huffman Prairie. If you leave the museum, if you look on the right side, there'll be a sign that'll direct you to Huffman Prairie if you want to see that. It's just a flat cow pasture that they could take off. Because they now had power, they could take off from level ground, climb, do their experiments, come back and land, and continue their work. They kept improving their aircraft design, improving the engine, tweaking their design until in 1905, they finally had a design they felt was a practical design, something that they could sell to somebody else. And so they kind of froze their design at that time and started looking for customers. They contacted the government to see if America wanted to buy any airplanes. At first, the Army wasn't interested, the government wasn't interested, the Army wasn't interested. But in 1907, when the Aeronautical Division was established, the Aeronautical Division was sent to talk to the Wright brothers, see what they had. They worked out a specification of what the Army would want in a heavier than air flying machine. They said they wanted something that would carry 2 people, a pilot and an observer. It had to fly over 40 miles per hour. It had to stay airborne for over an hour, and it had to be easily dismantled so they could take it apart, put it on a wagon, and move it from place to place, because that's how they moved observation balloons around at that time, and they still had that mentality. That's how they would have to move this thing around. So that was part of the original specification. In 1908, Orville went to Fort Myers in Virginia to demonstrate their flying machine. Everything went fine for about 2 weeks, but then there was an accident. One of the propeller tips broke. It severed some of the supporting wires. The airplane went out of control and crashed. The passenger, Lieutenant Selfridge, was killed. Orville was severely injured. He broke his hip, ribs, several other bones. He was in the hospital for about 7 weeks. But the Army was sufficiently impressed that they said, okay, when you've recovered and build a new airplane, come back, we'll continue the testing, and then we'll consider buying the airplane. And so that's what they did. So a year later, in 1909, Orville went back to Fort Myers with a new airplane. This is an exact reproduction of the 1909 Wright Flyer. So this is built to the original specifications and designs of that airplane. The original's in Smithsonian, but this is a reproduction. And that was the airplane that Orville was demonstrating at Fort Myers. He completed the testing. The Army approved it and bought it. So it became the first first power-controlled, heavier-than-air aircraft bought by any government, bought by the Army. It was not the first powered aircraft bought by the Army. The Army had actually bought a dirigible a year earlier. A dirigible is a powered balloon, kind of like a Goodyear blimp. So it's got a elongated balloon with engines on it to drive it around. They did buy a dirigible in 1908, so that was actually the first powered airplane, but this was the first powered heavier-than-air airplane. So this is the 1909 Wright Flyer.
How far they can fly?
Pardon?
The first one, how far?
I'm sorry?
How far?
They could fly over an hour, so they could. They had about 40 miles per hour, so they could go maybe 60, 70 miles, depending on how the winds were doing. Okay, so we had the Wright Flyer. Now, when Orville went to Fort Myers in 1908 the first time, Wilbur went to France with a flyer to demonstrate over there. In Europe, there were a lot of experimenters who had been doing experiments in flying machines. They were relatively successful in taking off and flying, but they only had the rudder and the elevator control, so they couldn't really turn very well. They couldn't bank and turn. When Wilbur got there, they all kind of scoffed. They heard about these Wright brothers who claimed they had this very successful flying machine. They've been flying around for years, etc., etc. They thought they were just braggarts. So a large crowd formed to see Wilbur for his first flight. Figured they would just laugh at him when he made a fool of himself. He took off, flew off to the end of the field, and turned around. Came back over their heads to the other end of the field, turned around again, went back and forth over their heads for about 15, 20 minutes, came down, landed where he started, and they went crazy because they'd never seen an airplane that could turn in the air like that. They all wanted to know how he did it. By that time, the Wright brothers had patented their wing warping technology, so they sold licenses for that wing warping technology to the experimenters in Europe, who then incorporated it in their airplanes, and so they could now turn just as well. And from that was really when aviation really took off to be quite, figuratively and literally took off. They could now control their airplanes. So that was 1908, 1909. Now, what happens in 1914, 5 years later? Okay? World War I broke out.
Yeah.
Suddenly, all of Europe is at war. You have, at that time, you had the machine guns had been developed, the artillery was advanced, the old way of fighting, of just marching your troops against each other, didn't work very well. So it quickly deteriorated into trench warfare. You basically had 2 long trenches. You had one side of one trench, the other side of the other trench, and they basically were stuck there. Those trenches, they couldn't make much progress against each other. As soon as they got out of their trench to try to attack, they'd be mowed down by machine guns. That was actually perfect conditions for observation balloons. By that time, the telephone had been invented, so now you had the observer in the basket of the observation balloon up there with a telephone line directly to the artillery. He could sit up there and say, I want you to hit this target. Oh, you're hitting a little long, back it up a little bit. Now you're hitting right on. And so it's absolutely devastating. So the observation balloons were at the peak of their effectiveness at the beginning of World War I. But they couldn't see very far behind enemy lines. They could only see a certain distance. So both sides started using their new powered airplanes. they would fly an unarmed observation plane behind enemy lines, see what was going on, come back and report. At first, as I said, they were unarmed. You'd have a German plane go one way, a British plane come the other, they kind of wave at each other as they went by each other. Well, that quickly deteriorated to where they start shaking their fists at each other, then they started taking up pistols and rifles and shooting at each other. Eventually, they gave the observer a machine gun on a swivel mount so he could shoot at the other airplane, and quickly they decided to design airplanes specifically to shoot down other airplanes. That's what we call a fighter aircraft today. At that time they called them pursuit aircraft because they were pursuing the other airplanes. The term pursuit aircraft continued through World War II. So when we get to the World War II section, you'll see airplanes designated like P-40, P-51. That P stands for pursuit. So they still call them pursuit aircraft, even in World War II. They won't start calling them fighter aircraft or using the F designation until you get to the Korean War. Okay, so they were pursuit aircraft designed specifically to shoot down other airplanes. They quickly decided the best way to shoot down another airplane would be to just aim the airplane straight ahead and shoot the gun straight ahead. And so you aim the airplane, you aim the gun at the same time. Well, that means you're shooting straight ahead. You want the gun in front of the pilot, but you got a propeller in the way. That's not a very good thing. You might shoot off your own propeller. So a Frenchman came up with the idea of putting a metal plate on the back of the propeller to deflect any bullets that hit the propeller. So as you can imagine, every now and then you get a bullet going ping, ping, ping all over the place. Not a very safe way to do it, but it worked. He was able to shoot down about 5 German airplanes. But then he crash landed behind German lines. The Germans captured his airplane, saw how he was firing through the propeller. They decided that was a stupid idea. So they came up with what's called an interrupter gear. Basically, it's a cam on the drive shaft so that when the propeller's just about to get in the way of the gun, it stops the gun from firing for just a split second until the propeller's out of the way. Once it's out of the way, the gun's allowed to fire again. So it just interrupts the gun for just a split second. It just maybe stops one bullet at a time, but it's enough to prevent you from shooting off your own propeller. That's called an interrupter gear. Germans started using those. Pretty soon the British and the French figured it out as well, and that became the standard for pursuit aircraft in World War I. This aircraft behind me is a SPAD 7. This is a pursuit aircraft from 1960, so only 2 years into the war. Only took them 2 years to get to that point of development. If you think about it, this is 7 years after the Wright Flyer. Very short period of time, but it's a much more advanced aircraft. Now you have a liquid-cooled V8 engine on there, much more powerful engine. It's a completely enclosed cockpit. Well, not enclosed cockpit, but I mean it's streamlined. You still have an open cockpit sitting out, but it's much more streamlined. It was about 3 times as fast as the Wright Flyer, so much faster, more powerful engine, and of course it has the gun on it. It has the gun firing through the propeller. You can notice right there at the top. Yes,
Is there any evidence of any pilot
that are firing the guns through the propeller, and I'll point those out as well when we get there. So this is a SPAD 7, as I said, a French design. Now, if you notice on the side of the aircraft, it has an emblem that is a Native American head wearing a war bonnet. That is the symbol of the Lafayette Escadrille or Lafayette Squadron. That was a group of American volunteers who were flying for the French before America became involved in the war. America was neutral until 1917. So the war started in 1914. We were neutral until 1917. So we were not involved in the war until then. So, but there were American volunteers who were fighting for the French and the British, and some of them were flying for the French. They were flying with French squadrons, but eventually they convinced the French to establish a squadron of just American volunteers, and that was the Lafayette Escadrille or Lafayette Squadron. The advantage from the standpoint of America was when we finally did join the war in 1917, we had no combat aircraft. All we had were unarmed observation planes and trainer aircraft. We had no armed airplanes. We had no trained combat pilots. So when the Army went over to France, they basically pulled all the American volunteers out of the French Air Corps and pulled them into the American Army and made them an initial cadre, initial group of trained, experienced pursuit pilots who could then pass on that knowledge, that experience to the incoming Americans who had no experience. So basically started us off with some trained, experienced pilots. Now throughout World War I, again, we had no combat aircraft, so we bought all of our aircraft from our allies. So the airplanes that I'll show you are all going to be French, British, Italian design airplanes that we bought from our allies in World War I. We didn't build any of our own combat airplanes. It's an American observation plane or trainer aircraft, mostly trainer aircraft. This is a Curtiss JN4D, or nicknamed the Jenny aircraft. This was used for training American pilots here in the United States before they got to France. Because it was a training aircraft, the Army bought several thousand of these. After the war, they were all Army surplus. So they were sold very cheaply to anybody who wanted to fly, any pilots coming back from overseas who wanted to continue flying. So if you heard the term barnstormer, barnstormers were pilots who would fly around after World War II, or after World War I, I'm sorry, in the 1920s. Barnstormers would fly around rural areas. They'd fly over a rural town, get people interested in this airplane flying overhead, and then they'd land in a farmer's field. They would then offer to take people up for rides in their airplane. That's why they're called barnstormers, because they're basically fly over the barn, land, and take people up. So when you hear the term barnstormer, most of them were flying Jennies. So because these were Army surplus, very cheap, those pilots would be flying these Jenny aircraft. So barnstormers typically fly these Jennies. Okay, yeah. I want to show off this next engine, V8 liquid-cooled engine. This is what's called a rotary engine. This is an air-cooled engine, and you notice the entire engine spins. So it has a circular configuration of pistons. The propeller is fixed to the engine, and so the engine and the propeller spin together. That makes it a very reliable engine, because if one of the spark plugs fouls, the momentum of the engine will just carry it through that piston that isn't operating, and so it'll run on 8 or 7 cylinders, depending on how many cylinders are fouled. It'll just keep running. So it's a very reliable engine. The problem is, it's a giant gyroscope. If you play with a gyroscope, you turn it one way, it pitches another way. So you have a giant gyroscope like this on the front of an airplane that's pretty lightweight, just wooden fabric. If you come in for landing, if you make a rudder input, it's going to pitch your nose up and down. If it pitches down and you're close to the ground, you smack into the ground. So it made it very tricky to land these aircraft because of this gyroscopic effect on the engine. Pilots might survive a combat mission where you're flying around up in the air. It's not a problem if you move like that. But coming into landing, it's difficult. So some pilots would survive a combat mission only to crash on landing because it was very tricky to land these. But that was typically the standard engine in World War I. Now there's also what's called a radial engine. A radial engine has the same circular configuration, but the engine remains fixed and only the propeller spins. There were some radial engines in World War I, but most of this type of configuration were the rotary ones where the engine spun as well. But once you get after World War I, you're going to see just strictly radial engines. Radials became the standard. When we get to World War II, if you see an engine with a circular configuration like that, it's going to be a radial engine. The advantage of radial engine is you can make much bigger engines because you don't have to worry about the gyroscopic effect. You can also stack the rows, the circular rows of pistons. So the largest piston engine we have in the museum has 4 rows of 7 cylinders for a total of 28 cylinders. It produces 3,500 horsepower. It's a huge engine, very heavy, very powerful engine. If you want to see that engine, it's in the second building. When you go in the second building, you'll see, as soon as you come in the second building, on the right side, you'll see a big cargo airplane with the front end opened up as the doors. On the far end of that airplane, under the wing, there is a display talking about mechanics and the people who maintain the airplanes, and there is a cutaway version of one of those 28-cylinder engines in there. So that's the biggest engine we have here in the museum. Okay, so this is a Newport, another French airplane that we bought. Again, has the rotary engine. This airplane here, this is the Sopwith Camel. This was the top British fighter in World War I. It was very maneuverable, relatively fast. So it was one of the most numerously built of the British fighters. We bought quite a few of them for our service as well. If you remember the comic book, Peanuts comic strip, and Snoopy versus the Red Baron, Snoopy always imagined he was flying the Sopwith Camel, and the Red Baron was flying the Fokker triplane. That's the airplane hanging up there. Now this is a wind tunnel from the Cook Field. I mentioned the Cook Field earlier, the base that was before Wright Field. This wind tunnel was used there for ground testing. Eventually, McCook Field was surrounded by Dayton, so they couldn't expand it anymore. As airplanes got bigger, they needed a longer runway to operate larger aircraft, so they basically had to come to a new field, and that's when they moved to Wright Field, which is where we are right now. So and then when they moved the museum displays, and they also moved this wind tunnel here. Okay, now the next plane I want to point out is this, basically SPAD 13. Basically an improved version of the SPAD 7, has 2 engines instead of 1, more powerful engine. The main reason we point this out is that it's painted in the scheme of Captain Eddie Rickenbacker. Eddie Rickenbacker was the top American ace in World War I. He came from Columbus, Ohio, which is only about 60 miles from here, so he's a local Ohio boy. Before the war, he was a relatively famous race car driver, well known as a race car driver. Because of that, when he went overseas with the Army, they made him a chauffeur to drive generals around. He quickly convinced the generals that that was a waste of his time, so they allowed him to become a fighter pilot or a pursuit pilot. And as I said, he became the top American ace. He had 26 aerial victories. That was pretty impressive because he only flew for about 9 months because America, again, joined the war so late in the war. He only had 9 months of flying time, and he managed to get 26 aerial victories. So that was Eddie Rickenbacker.